and he saw the size of the cabinet agencies he could control, he said, no, that's not of interest to me to shrink myself back down again. That's not where I'm coming from. And we'll get back to Obama and how horrendous that's been in a few minutes. But first I wanted to talk a little bit about a real important thing that took place right about the start of the Bush administration that has a lot of people confused that I mentioned, called the FISA bypass. And FISA, I said early on, was the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It came out in late 70s because the nation's second biggest intelligence agency, the National Security Agency, who most people don't know about, admitted in Congress that it had been monitoring phone calls and everything of U.S. citizens involved in Vietnam protests and all that. And they said, well, that isn't what you were designed for. You're supposed to be doing global military intelligence collection and all this kind of stuff. So we're going to create this court, but it's going to be a secret court. And its members cannot be allowed to be known by the public. Since then, some judges have stood up and said, I'll admit I was a member of the FISA court. I'm in reform now, and hopefully I could go through a 12-step program. But it's like there was no way by which a U.S. citizen could find out anything about the FISA court or what judges were on it. And it became known over the course of a couple of decades for approving any kind of monitoring for U.S. citizens that was requested by the White House. But a funny thing happened in the 20 years between then and 9/11 and everything, is that the nation's two largest intelligence agencies, the NSA, and then the biggest by budget by far, the National Reconnaissance Office, which spends about $12 to $14 billion a year on spy satellites, started working together to move all of NSA's listening assets to space. So they didn't need to build antennas on the ground anymore. They picked up all phone calls, all internet traffic, everything from space. But there's a funny thing when you start moving to geosynchronous satellites. There's no easy way to turn off a satellite as it goes over the Western Hemisphere. So what is really taking place is the NSA and NRO are collecting all our communication information globally all the time, but it cannot be acknowledged if it takes place inside the United States. And so what George Bush did, after he was messing around with this for a while, he says, I'm going to go to a FISA court with about like 300 exceptions right here, people inside the United States I want to monitor. And they looked at his huge stack, and said, oh no, we love you always, but this is too ridiculous. You can't do this. So for the first time in history in 2005, the U.S. government admitted there was a higher secret court called the FISA Court of Appeals. And it too had secret judges and had never met before 2005, even though it was authorized in 1978. And so they brought it to the secret circuit court, and the court said, oh sure, go ahead, monitor anybody you want. And after that, Cheney and Bush looked at each other and said, that was a bunch of shit. We shouldn't have to go through that again. And so Bush just signed an order that said, FISA bypass. I will allow broadband intercept globally anytime, anywhere, for any purpose, and we don't have to go through any rigmarole about this. We'll just admit that the NSA collects information on a global basis all the time. Well, they didn't say that in so many words, but that in effect was what they were doing. And so FISA bypass became kind of the unappealable law of the land because Congress never tried to appeal it. Some people will tell you that Congress did a reauthorization of the Patriot Act that changed a little FISA stuff in 2006. And then they had something called the Protect America Act that put on some more packet sniffers in like 2008 or 2009. But none of that changed the basic thing. FISA bypass is the same today as it was in 2005. Barack Obama had a chance to change that. He did not, because he saw it as a very, very useful thing to always keep in place. So when people talk about FISA bypass, they're not talking about the FBI coming in and listening to one phone call. They're talking about the broadband interception of all packet communications, all phone calls, all the time, everywhere by the NSA and the NRO. And there is so much information to store that the NSA now is building a vast plant in Camp Williams, Utah called Storage Station Freedom, to store all the information about all the people, globally they're doing. I mean, that stuff, you couldn't write a better result than this stuff, some of this stuff. But anyway, when Obama first came into office, the ACLU had prepared this kind of scorecard, report card type thing for him. Get out of Guantanamo, blah, 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 and all this stuff. Everybody was kind of expecting he'd get, C-type grades, because, he'd make promises about this and that. People didn't have that high of expectations. But what was really frightening was that it wasn't just an issue of benign neglect. It was that Obama, and particularly his Attorney General, Eric Holder, were some of the most vicious prosecutors of Espionage Act, secrecy clauses, everything. I tell people Eric Holder is every bit as evil as like John Ashcroft or Alberto Gonzalez. And they go, huh? I go, it's because you don't hear about it. Some of the things here, I just thought I'd mention that they have been doing lately. Over the last couple of years, they've had 5 open cases on the Espionage Act, none of which involve true spying, all of which involve releasing information to the media. You probably all know the name of Bradley Manning with WikiLeaks, but there's also a guy who was inside the NSA named Thomas Drake, who tried to reveal some of the details of Project Trailblazer, which was part of this massive monitoring thing. They charged him with the Espionage Act. Jeff Sterling with the CIA for leaking information at the New York Times. Shamai Leibowitz, Stephen Kim, all these people who were talking to journalists and so therefore became Class 1 felony spies in the mind of Obama and Holder. And I mean, it's appalling that they would even think of this kind of stuff. There's a case the FBI took against the Islamic group in LA, the Shura Council, where the Shura Council brought a countersuit and they tried to find out the extent of spying going on. And the FBI kept saying things and they got disproven and everything. And finally, one of Holder's prosecutors in April 2009 admitted to the judge that they'd been lying to him and they really had like 17 more wiretaps than they admitted. And he said, but Judge, it is the White House's and the Justice Department's position that in matters of national security, we can lie to a federal judge. And the judge just looked at him and said, there's this president named Nixon. They tried that before and it didn't work then. And like, this is 40 years later. What are you giving me here? And so, but the judge chewed him out, but did nothing. Said, well, because it was a national security issue, we'll forgive you this time. That kind of thing. And I guess the real frustrating part has been to see various laws from the Patriot Act time being pulled together to make cases that really otherwise couldn't be made. Like, there's this notion of material support for terrorism. And it used to be that people would think, well, maybe if you talk to some of those real, nasty FARC guerrillas in Colombia or PFLP, or whatever, that they could get you for that. But no. The courts ruled that if you were a nonviolence consultation specialist and you went out to talk to like the Kurdish PKK in Turkey or the Spanish ETA in the Basque region of Spain, and to try to encourage them to use peaceful negotiation instead of bombs, that you were providing material support for terrorism because you're not even allowed to talk to them, even if you're trying to talk them into peace. You can't talk to them at all. And so therefore, if they have any evidence that any peace group anywhere has talked to anyone that has ever advocated violence and ever been on the Attorney General's watch list, then they can just raid you and call you a material supporter of terrorism. Which is what the FBI, under Barack Obama and Eric Holder, did September of 2010. They raided peace centers in Minneapolis, Chicago, and Los Angeles, took all the stuff, took people in, and the only reason you haven't heard about any court cases out of that is because every single person indicted refused to testify before a grand jury. And like, refusal to testify before a grand jury can be big felony, penalties. Every single person in all those peace centers said, we're not going to do this. This is outrageous. And as a result, They had no case, they dropped the case, it's closed. But this is the kind of thing they can do. They have the power at any time to choose a peace group, a labor group, an Occupy group, and say, we have this kind of information coming together through the manifestations of the Patriot Act to make this look like terror by our definition of terror, because what we call terror can be whatever we choose to. A couple other just examples of the kind of stuff they're doing, and this sounds like war-related, but its connection directly to civil liberties at home is going to be clear in a minute. The ACLU filed suit against the White House middle of last year because they said, you're starting to use drones to target individuals, like Al-Aqli in Yemen. And they said, there was a White House statement in the late 70s that said, we will not assassinate foreign leaders or foreign representatives, blah, blah, blah. What happened obviously with the takedown of Osama bin Laden and SEAL Team 6, but also with the massive use of drones, is these drones don't go after a big camp, they can go after one individual. And so they become a tool of assassination. And the minute the ACLU filed that lawsuit, Holder said, this is a state secret lawsuit. We will not even respond to it because the very nature of the lawsuit itself is a state secret. And that kind of argument had never been tried since the 1950s. And the judges bought it. And the suit was totally wiped out. And of course, 6 months later, Al-Aqli was no more because he had been wiped out by a drone. Now the interesting thing is that drones, come in two varieties. You got your passive defensive drone that is used for massive surveillance. You've got your active, aggressive, offensive drone that is armed with missiles and bombs that is used for active attack. Both of them can prove dangerous. So far, we haven't had any armed drones in the U.S., although there's a lot of talk about them on the borders. But the military now, through a program called 1033 Pass, where they're passing through materiel to local law enforcement, have offered drones to like the state of North Dakota and a few other places as regular surveillance tools to use. Now, if this isn't bad enough, Jeff Rosen, he just wrote a recent book called Constitution 3.0. Haven't gotten a copy of it yet, but he was being interviewed last week on Fresh Air about this book. And they were trying to dream up what's going to be happening 10 years from now. And he said, we're only about 20 years away from being able to monitor and define in a loose fashion, remotely, brainwaves of people and determine what they're thinking. He focused on the passive danger of this in kind of the, what's the name of that science fiction movie where you've got
Minority Report.
Minority Report. You arrest the person before they commit the crime because you know they're going to commit the crime. And he was talking about this, and he was talking about what happens with a jury if they knew that the suspect intended to kill or something like that. But of course, just as with drones, there's an aggressive offensive act to that. What if the Pentagon discovers a way to say, we know that this is a group of Salafist combat Islamic Muslims, and therefore we're going to mess up their brainwaves from 50 miles away. What if this is a group within Occupy, within the peace movement, that we think will try to claim a space, and we can just mess up their brainwaves from 20 miles away? This sounds like craziness, like science fiction. But drones sound like science fiction 20 years ago. And the scary thing about drones is not how much they were introduced, but that they became a targeted assassination tool with